Hi guys, I'm Mike and this is F1 Fanatics. Welcome back to another F1 Worldwide, again in the kind of makeshift studios here, but we've got some F1 hats in the background, so it works for today. But as usual on F1 Worldwide, we'll be discussing a topic with a guest, and F1 Worldwide was brought up because the original guest was from Indonesia, so we like to show that F1 is a global sport and around the world. So very happy to welcome today Mr. Cranky himself, Nick. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Yes, it's going to be fun. I appreciate it.
No problem at all. It's going to be great, and the great topic that we have today is, you guys actually might have seen the tweet. Well, for us, this is actually take two, because with anything within the YouTube world, sometimes can come across technical difficulties, but it's still going to be a brilliant chat because we've had a bit of time in between that chat now. But it allowed us to kind of ask you guys as well who you think is the best out of the 6 world champions who won one world title between 1990 and up to kind of present day. Those world champions are Nigel Mansell, Damon Hill, Jacques Villeneuve, Kimi Räikkönen, Jenson Button, and of course Nico Rosberg, the most recent of those, in 2016. So we will go in chronological order and kind of have a look at those. So Nick, I'm going to start off with you. We're looking at probably one of the big ones on this list for a lot of people, and that is Nigel Mansell. What do you think of Nigel Mansell?
Yeah, so Nigel has always been one that, especially something I've talked about lately, it's hard to ignore just how talented Nigel really was. And I think the biggest sticking point for me has always been he's proven himself as a race winner. And you know the championships that the championship that he's won, and then you've got '86, which arguably very easily could have been his. But his teammates are undeniably good, and that's something you can look at his record. The other thing that I like to talk about is, aside from the fact that he had the FW14B, he had to compete in different regulation, like the aerodynamics and the engine changes. At least for him, and the fact that he was successful across the board. That is something that I think Nigel, it should never be forgotten, and obviously it won't be forgotten about Nigel. And just the sheer fact that when you think about one-time champions, all the other times that they're not winning, it doesn't really ever seem like they're there. They're on par, or they're challenging for that title and just off. How many times has Nigel really been close in a title fight? How many times has he been a couple points off? How many times has he really gone down to the last few Grand Prix? So with Nigel, it almost seems like if you said he had, if you were someone was just forgotten history and he had 3 titles, like they just go along with it because he feels like a multiple title winner, and it's even hard to believe that he hasn't gotten that. So for me with Nigel, it's almost like a pinch my arm reminder. Hey, this he's actually only successfully pulled this off with the 14B. So I've always it's never felt like he should be on this list, but the fact that he is, for me, kind of puts him in rare air.
Absolutely, and Nigel, he is a top talent, and I think a lot of people, obviously I only, and like you, probably have the benefit of not really experiencing, Nigel's career like live and in person. We didn't get to experience that, but just going back in the way that obviously we do stuff, content creating about it, and obviously the in-depth analysis that you did on Williams recently, Mansell was a massive part of that success in the 80s and obviously the early 90s as well, and he's just an exciting talent. He's there's countless battles that you can just get YouTube clips of, Mansell fighting Prost, fighting Senna, fighting Nelson Piquet, wheel-to-wheel action. He was a driver who really drove on the edge, and like you said, he kind of feels like a multiple world champion. 86 and 87 were the close ones, and 86 is definitely the one that got away with, obviously, that rear puncture that happened in Adelaide. And he has to be, at the top of someone's list like this. Like you said, it doesn't feel right for him to be here, but what a talent he was. And although the W14B was an absolute rocket ship, one of the most technologically advanced cars ever. He still had to wrestle that car, and it was perfectly built around him, and the records he set that season were impressive enough, weren't they?
Yep, because he still had, so 91, Senna's still over at Honda, or at McLaren at that point. So, I mean, it's not as if he, just because he's off, he's got 72 points, just because he loses that title, I mean, that was still a good fight. You mentioned 87, when I think he lost that one in qualifying in Japan. But he went down to the wire there. And then another thing we've talked about is how when, someone who wins a title, who leaves and goes to, or has a particularly difficult year, I think back to the Judd years in 1988, when he's retired the car more than 50% of the time, he's always found a way. He goes to Ferrari, comes back and wins. So for me, Nigel's always been, he's got the second and third career, and he goes on to kart. So for me, he's just an all-around undeniable talent. And I think having him here, it's almost everyone shaking their head going, yeah, we agree. So I think, with him, it's so impressive to see when you actually look at what he's done. And he's gotten second. Actually, now you say that, he's gotten second place in the championship at least three times. So I don't know how many times that's actually happened. So that's impressive on its own.
Yeah. I mean, no doubt that is impressive. And I think, just to round off on Nigel before we move on to our next, funnily enough, Williams driver, just the way that the top teams wanted him. In the 80s, the 90s, three of the top teams, Ferrari will always be a top team because of their heritage and their name. So Ferrari wanted him. Obviously, McLaren was taken by Senna and Prost. And, Williams wanted him through that period in 86, 87. He left because obviously the car went down with losing the engine partnership with Honda, but came back and was excellent for them through 91 and 92. And that's, if the top guys in the sport want you, that's kind of a really big compliment to your talent that you've got. But we'll move on to Damon Hill now. And, a one-time world champion, his prime years were between 94 and 96 with that rivalry that developed with Michael Schumacher. Sadly, in the wake of the passing of Ayrton Senna in 1994. But, what are your thoughts on Damon Hill, Nick?
Yeah, Damon has been, I've got a soft spot for Damon. And I think Damon was a product of an unfortunate situation in which he was always paired next to someone like a Mansell, and then he was paired next to a Prost, and he's even got a couple second place finishes to his name and a third place coming into that Williams for the first time in 93. So Damon's always had, as you've mentioned before, big shoes to fill, big expectations, and then the way he was kind of pushed out of Williams before the season's even over, he ends up winning that title, goes on the next season, and does pretty well. So, what was that with Air? Well, I guess pretty well is a way to say it. They didn't have the best car in the world, but neither did Williams. But Damon's always been someone that I've never understood why he receives not necessarily contempt, but he never fully, at least my understanding and how I look at it, he's never fully received the proper benefit that a world champion has. When he steps into the car, it's almost like where there's Damon Hill, he'll win if the circumstances are right. But in reality, he was a winner over season after season after season, circumstance after circumstance. He stepped up and he delivered. And a lot, the people who don't see Damon like that, who see them just as a proper, great talent, I think that this is something that'll be just, that you won't agree with the fact that maybe he doesn't get the full benefit. But there are a lot of people, like I said, who always seen him as second fiddle, that when he does win, it seems like, the circumstances were right. I often hear that, Michael's car wasn't blah, 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 or he went to Ferrari, blah, blah, blah. When in reality, it doesn't really matter who got in another competing car. And in 95, 96, those years, Damon was always going to be the favorite, or at least up there at the top. So when he actually ends up winning, and you talked about the Murray, that final Murray call too, the lump in my throat, I think everyone kind of reverberated that, that sentiment, that to see Damon actually do this and pull this off in the face of everything, it was incredible. And I think, it's it's a product of the Schumacher rivalry. It's very easy to. He's a very likable person compared to these people. It seems very. I guess I'll call it polarizing to say, Damon or Schumacher. It's really hard to. I don't know a lot of people that say they like both, at least in this rivalry. So he was in a difficult time, and he proved time and time again, 93, 94, 95, 96. Those are some of those very impressive seasons that we often don't really talk about, and we probably should do it a little bit more.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with this. I think Damon Hill, for some reason, is what we'll emphasise on this list more is you don't just get handed a world title. Every world champion has earned the right to be world champion. Look, Formula One is a human-based sport. Humans make the machines and humans drive the machines. It's all kind of man-made stuff. So there will be mistakes. There will be things that couldn't plan out perfectly. Yes, you can always argue with the what-ifs of certain scenarios. But Damon Hill has something that all champions have to have, and the fact that he was a fighter. He stepped up when in the incredible difficult situation of leading a team in the wake of Ayrton's sad passing, and even with Michael Schumacher's disqualifications, he took it to the last race in Adelaide, and obviously he would have, it looked like he probably would have won the title that race if Michael hadn't have collided with him. And one of Michael's poor moments, but an honest racer, Damon, he was in a title fight there. 95, Michael was supreme, but they battled. He didn't give up. They battled all season. And yeah, there were mistakes on both parts from both of them in collisions, but that showed that how much it meant to him. And then when it finally culminated in 1996 to his world title, it was, impressive and mightily deserved. And yes, obviously it was in Schumacher's first year at Ferrari, but he still had to drive that car to the title, and it was still a superb championship win, and he's a fantastic driver and should be given that credit it's deserved. And for some reason, time has looked unfavourably on him as, time goes, as, like you said, a very underrated guy. But I think what also stands out for me for Damon Hill is the fact that even after leaving Williams, and you talk about him being undervalued in terms of, when Mansell came back for his short stint, he was almost, I think, getting paid like triple, it was rumoured, to what actual Damon Hill was. And also the fact that when he went to Jordan, he would still fight in that car in 98 in Spa. His last Grand Prix victory actually stands out to me as, he fought Michael in the rain, and Michael would go on supreme, and the collision with DC is another part of history, but it was still an absolutely superb drive from Damon in the rain to do that. And I think that shows his ability, really, and is worthy of note. So we'll move on to the next driver, and that's Jacques Villeneuve. And he's a polarising opinion, I think, Jacques. And so what are your thoughts on Jacques, Nick?
Yeah, so I think for me, I've always been a fan of him on track, and I think his demeanor, some of the things he says, and just even, as time goes on, I think we bake that into the cake in terms of the kind of driver Villeneuve was. But as a young talent coming in, and again, he's got a good car, he's got Damon's car, so he's got his rookie season is something that we've talked about before as well. Like that rookie season is something that even you obviously know about, but you don't until you actually look very, very closely. It's incredibly impressive because he doesn't drive like a rookie in Formula One. He's got 4 wins and 11 podiums that first season. Again, a great car, but he's losing to the world champion, and it's not as if he's off the podium much after that. He's got 2 out of the points finishes, 2 off the podium or 3 out of the points finishes, and then 3 retirements. So that first season he's coming out the gates storming. So the second he steps into the number one seat, it becomes pretty evident that he's going to be a title favorite. And he obviously does that with, 7 wins? Yeah, seven victories, which is impressive on its own. So everything off track aside, it's really hard to deny the fact that he's quick. Now, I think coupled with the fact of how he's portrayed, or at least just how he carries himself, not portrayed because it's not all unfair, he never really got another car after that. He's got the Supertech engine, the Honda engine with Lucky Strike, the Lucky Strike branded BAR. So he's got a bevy of retirements that next season in 1999. And once you get to those kinds of numbers where you're just retiring after retiring and you're failing to even win a race, it becomes difficult to actually justify someone who may be difficult on the grid, and also someone who's not getting race results. And that's when I go back and I compare that and contrast it to Mansell, who can leave, have a tough season, go to Ferrari, have still kind of a tough season, and come back and win a world title. I think that's really rare, and I think that speaks volumes to your likability on the paddock. And I think that that wasn't he did himself no favors there, but I think that's the kind of person he was, and it made him the person who came out his rookie year and win, because he is a hard-nosed driver and a no-nonsense kind of person. But he never really played ball. He never really played politics, which, I think depending on your cup of tea, that may be okay. And being in a tough era where there's a lot, this changeover from the 97 Concords, 98, and even more change with Ferrari taking over in the 2000s, that's a tough time to be a driver and, meander your way into a top seat, because really the top seat is taken by Barrichello, by Schumacher. So for me, it was a tough time to drive. He got his title in, and I think he did it at the perfect time, because anything after that, he didn't really stand a chance leaving in 2006.
I completely agree with Jacques in terms of, he is a talented driver. And again, I think, with a few of these guys, you feel you have to defend them, to go, look, these guys are world champions, so they're talented drivers. And what he did before coming into Formula One was impressive, being an IndyCar champion at so young, winning the Indy 500, a challenging race in itself, so young. And that rookie season, to put it in perspective, a lot of people, when we spoke about this the first time round, rate Lewis Hamilton's as the best rookie season ever. And he only equaled the records set by Jacques Villeneuve in that 96 season, where he won, 4 races, and he became the only rookie in the history of the sport to finish second in the championship. And, that can't be taken away from him. And yes, 1997 again, the Williams was the best car on the grid, and it was, the best car for Williams, since 1997. They haven't quite reached the heights since then, after Adrian Newey left for McLaren. But what he achieved in that car and that fight, and he was a no-nonsense racer, and like Damon, he fought Michael. He wasn't prepared to kind of just let him kind of bulldoze through. He was willing to fight for it, and he earned his right as championship. Yes, for the things he came out, he's a polarising opinion in terms of some of the things that Jacques says, you don't agree with, but you don't have to necessarily agree with or like the bloke to kind of have to recognise his talent, that he was a top driver. He had what would probably later I'd call Fernando Alonso syndrome, in terms of going to teams at the wrong time. And like you said, it never quite worked out for him after that, and he never got a car after that was capable of winning a championship. And that's probably where it's reflected. That's where taints the memory, because it happened so early in his career, and he had so much of a perceived decline afterwards that people will kind of note it as a fluke. But I don't think you can ever fluke a Formula One World Championship, and unfairly looked at, but a very worthy driver and part of the conversation, of course. So we'll then move on to, I think, well, from looking at your responses, another one of the popular guys after Mansell, and that is Kimi Räikkönen. And obviously Formula 1 world champion in 2007, Ferrari's last world champion. What do you make of Kimi, Nick?
Kimi is obviously incredibly impressive, and he seems to have different, I'll call it seasons. His career is so long, and it's hard to, when you see him on the podium, that infamous picture, at least for me, it stands out. Him on the podium in 2003 with Michael grabbing his head and Kimi smiling, and it's like, that's a different guy. But in reality, it's not. It's the same old Kimi, and circumstances have changed, and I don't think he shifted in terms of wanting to race, maybe how he drives or just the car he's in. But Kimi's also reminds me a lot like Mansell, to someone who can be likable, but at the same time, one of the world-class talent. He can leave Ferrari, come back and not leave Ferrari not in the best of circumstances, and then leave the sport entirely, come back to Ferrari and do his job. And I think at that point in time, he had a job to do. And, if you're not a difficult driver, I think as this conversation has kind of shown me, at least through looking back through the moments in history, if you're someone who's not a difficult driver, you'll find a seat, because obviously these guys are top talents in the world. So Kimi's younger years, when in those first 6 seasons, he's got 2 second place, a win, and a third, so 2/3. So he's someone that, even as a young driver, and I remember specifically those McLaren fights, that 03 season stands out to me the most. A young Kimi actually on the podium, taking it to Michael. Michael wasn't able to run away with it like he did in 2002 and win such a commanding season. So Kimi is someone that I think he seems more relaxed. And again, that seems like one of those things as you go deeper into his career. He seems like that kind of driver, but relaxed doesn't mean slow at all in any way, shape, or form. And I think most people will know that. So him at Lotus and specifically getting 12th, 4th, 6th, 4th, I don't really think that paints him in the best light. You really have to go and look at his entire portfolio. And when you look at those first years, especially with Montoya at Williams, Kimi at McLaren, I don't think Schumacher was sleeping easy. And some of those seasons, like I said, are giant wins. But I think these drivers would be the first, anyone on the grid would be the first to tell you, especially a young Kimi, you can never, ever count him out. You never know what he's going to do next, and he's always capable of a race win. And that is it feels patronizing to say, much less like the other ones where we feel like you have to defend it in the same way. But with Kimi, he really does speak for himself, and I'm incredibly impressed, especially with his younger days when he was fighting in a car that really had no business necessarily being there from the aero department.
I completely agree. And Raikkonen, in his prime years, which often probably get described between 03 and 07, 03 was when he really kind of seriously launched himself on the scene of F1 and announced himself that people were like, wow, this kid is good. And, it shows the raw talent that he had in the fact that, with only 23 racing kind of, career races to date before entering Formula 1. I mean, that's incredibly inexperienced compared to, the usual lengths that people went through to get into Formula 1. And he achieved 6 in his first race, and he got recommended by Mika Häkkinen, Schumacher's probably greatest rival through his career, to take over his seat at McLaren. And I think that kind of really shows, it helps probably that he was Finnish, but his talent really was there. I don't think nationality came into it. I think Mika was like, wow, this kid's good. And 2003 was incredibly impressive how he pushed him. 2005, he was lightning and probably one of the best McLarens never to win a championship. It was immense that year, and just the reliability again let it down, and him and Fernando were going through. And I believe we spoke about this when we did first time round. I think his 2007 title year often gets underrated because a lot of that season was, covered by Spygate and, the fight between Lewis and Alonso, and it just, how that escalated and went really sour really quickly. The 2-time world champion at that stage and this kind of young rookie. coming in. But Kimi was superb. By the summer, he kind of looked out of it, but his consistency, I think you had it up before in terms of just the way that he finished the back end of the 07 season. It is an incredible... Yeah, he really earned that 07 championship, and after that, it never really quite materialised with him again. And then obviously he got shafted out in 2009 to kind of make way for Alonso coming in 2010. Had his rallying stint, but after that, Lotus, he had some standout performances still. I think Abu Dhabi in his return, winning that Grand Prix. Obviously one of his famous quotes of "Leave me alone, I know what I'm doing." But you know, I agree. He was likeable, and he's clearly likeable within teams because he went in at Ferrari. He knew Seb was number one man, but incredibly consistent to get Ferrari where they needed to be. And you know, it's incredibly impressive that he certainly is a very impressive driver on this list, I think, and certainly up in the upper echelons when we'll come to discussing who we think is the best out of these guys on the list. But that probably rounds off Kimi, and that moves us on to next, the winner of the Fairy Tale Championship, I like to think of it, in 2009, and that is Jenson Button. So your thoughts on Jenson, Nick?
Jenson is someone I'm still even currently working through, so I'm even to test myself, I'm making content about it, the 2009 season, because it's so difficult to distinguish between driver and car sometimes. But when you have a car like Braun, it becomes significantly more difficult to determine where Jenson stands compared to in the whole scheme of that season. But one of the things that stands out for me are how he started the 2009 season, his championship season, and how he ended the championship season. A lot of people will say, well, it's just the car. But the fight between him and his teammate, between Barrichello, wasn't particularly close. And at the same time, yes, once Vettel got his upgrades in Monaco, the win stopped for Jenson. But it wasn't as if the podium stopped. And going 6 out of 7, there's 4 or 5 drivers ever do that. That's incredible. I don't care what car you in, that's incredibly impressive. And his drive across all weather conditions. And then he ends the season, if he's already slightly declining and you see Sebastian on a charge, it'd be very easy for him to not necessarily roll over, but Sebastian clearly was on pace to do what he did from 2010 to 2013. He still had to fend him off. And like you mentioned in the beginning, even if you're trying to make the distinction, I catch myself going, well, it doesn't really matter if it's driver or car because he's talented enough to be in the position to receive the car. You don't just pop into a world-class car because, you were lucky. You had to obviously be talented. And so for me, that I sort of looked at the fight between him and Lewis a little bit different too once I really dug my feet into the Braun championship. And I did. I really started to actually respect the fight. He comes out ahead of Lewis and on one season. So Jenson is someone he goes from a top car, overwhelmingly the top car on the grid, leaves that, goes to a new team, and you go, oh, well, Jenson didn't win. That car had a lot of problems at McLaren, and as seen by Hamilton's unreliability too. So for me, him leaving Braun, going to a car, not winning again, that's not proof that he was a one-off fairy tale. That's not proof. Fairy tale, I use that, facetiously. I'm not saying it wasn't a great win. That's also not proof that he's not someone who is not capable of winning a championship. It is enough to say that he was always in the fight, especially he was obviously always in the fight. He was always capable of winning races, and given a little bit better of a car than that McLaren, which even Lewis struggled with, I think that he would have been taking the top spot on the podium a lot more. But Jenson is someone that, yes, got a good car, but when he was in the car, he has a title to his name, and for good reason. Went to a less solid car, comparatively speaking, and still managed to fight and put up a fair one. So for me, Jenson is kind of one of those no-brainers that it's like, yeah, it's obviously he's a very talented driver, and he's proven that through his race results across regulations, across cars, and across teammates who he's had a pretty good, a pretty good fight with across his entire career with.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest things you can credit Button with is in Hamilton's career, there are only 2 drivers to have beaten him as a teammate across the whole season. And Jenson is one of those, and the last person on our list, and Nico, is the other one. Jenson, we'll put him in a category because Nico's was self-inflicted. But like Jacques and like Damon, they were never given another World Championship capable car. The 2010 McLaren was probably the closest, but still it had its issues. It wasn't on the level of the Red Bull, and Fernando in the Ferrari just kind of sent it away. That was a good car come the second half, and how they were pushing it. Jenson, in changeable conditions, is probably one of the best drivers you'll ever see, and certainly one of the best modern drivers in terms of that dry to wet, knowing exactly the right time. And nothing highlights that more than Canada 2011. Like an absolutely superb race. And although he had the nerves of kind of that second half of the championship in 2009, he did see it over the line, and he fought, and it is a fair representation of the talent that he possessed within Formula One. And sometimes sport is all about being in the right place at the right time, and Jenson certainly was where it came out. I mean, he was on the verge of being in the wrong place at the wrong time at the start of that 2009 season, with obviously Honda pulling out. And to do what he did with Honda, obviously it didn't quite work out how they wanted, and they never really produced the car in his early stages career. But still getting that race win in 2006, again, he did something what great drivers do, and he got more out of the car than what should have been possible. And I think that's a really great trait to tag to Jenson, and an absolute brilliant driver on that front. And again, a worthy, as all of them are on this list, a worthy world champion. And it wasn't just the car, it was his ability as well. He still beat his teammate in Rubens Barrichello, an incredibly experienced guy, a guy who's been with Michael and learnt so much through that period. And it was an incredibly tough fight towards the end, but I always describe it as the fight of the journeyman, in terms of, obviously Button was still young and still had plenty of his career to go, as it showed competing in Formula One afterwards. But with Rubens, it felt like the opportunity for one of them to kind of forever put themselves in the history books, and Jenson won that battle. But an incredibly impressive guy, and you can't not give him credit for what he did during his years within the sport. So we move on to the last guy, and that is Nico Rosberg. And another driver on this. It is quite funny with these one-time champions. I would say a lot of them, other than, we'll come to that discussion, but I'd say a lot of them are polarising opinions of, just how good they were. And Nico Rosberg certainly falls into that category, with obviously retiring straight after winning the championship. So what were your thoughts on Nico?
Nico's always been someone that when you actually, I feel like I'm saying the same thing, and I think that you touched on it. When you are looking at one-time drivers, I feel like you're constantly trying to battle. Was it a product of circumstance? Was it luck? Or was it the fact that they're a talented driver and they had the opportunity, and that's what champions do? A multi-time champion, the only difference really is that they're maximizing the car at all times. But with Nico, even when he was, obviously he's probably got arguably the most difficult teammate to drive, but it's not as if when he's losing those years, the only thing that makes him a one-time champion is that he's in a vicious fight with Lewis, but it's not a blowout for the most part. And even leading into that, it wasn't a lot of the thing that I see or if I have conversations about is, he lucked into a car. Let's put aside the fact that he never really it was always a decent fight with Lewis. But going back to Williams, that car was a dumpster fire for most of the time. And that year, we're talking about Braun, that year in 2009 was Nico probably at his, in my opinion, I was most impressed by Nico. Obviously, his title season is impressive on its own, but consistently, he scored a number of P5s, and those races in 2009 and the talent on the grid and where the cars were and how they developed, that's not easy to do. And his just given the fact that he was so reliable that year, he's got one retirement in 2009. So Nico going in to Mercedes in that next season, that was probably the nail. I've always pegged it as if there were, if Williams was on their last two legs, or if they had just a little bit left, Nico leaving really did it for them because he was so talented and he consistently scored in the points, and that showed because by the time he got to fight Hamilton, I think that experience was great for him in developing him as a driver and saying, look, even when your chips are down, you need to fight. And in the dog days of that 2000, these other seasons, he never really phones it in. In Singapore in 2008, he gets that second place finish. He comes out the gates in 2008 with another podium. He's always been someone that if you were to cover up the Mercedes time, you go, given the car he's in, that's pretty talented on his own. So of course he gets promoted over to Mercedes. And then I've always felt that when you look at his entire career and you say he only won one, it kind of doesn't make sense. And he's got the best car in the grid. But as you've talked about and we've alluded to, that doesn't make you an automatic champion. You still have to fight, obviously, sometimes your teammate. And Nico, talk about unreliability all you want. Nico had his own fair share. And I think the way he retired just speaks volumes about the kind of competitor Hamilton was. I've never looked at it as a quote-unquote, just even with any negative connotation. I've looked at it as Hamilton is so difficult to beat, it's going to alter your reality. You need to shift and change everything about yourself to win. And I don't really think that's sustainable. So if he's someone that wanted to win a title after being at Williams, his fear probably is to go backwards and go, well, I don't ever want to have to never win a race again in a season and fight the car to even finish and cross the line. So I've never fully grasped why some people don't necessarily think he's such a great driver. I think it's not luck. It's not unreliability. He still scored. He still won the first four races of 2016, and he still finished in second place. People forget that. Lewis had one of the greatest finishes to a title I've ever seen to only lose in 2016. But Nico also, you got to remember, won in Belgium, Italy, Singapore, third in Malaysia, won Japan, and then the rest, he gets runner-up. If he doesn't do that, he loses that title. So it's always been the most fascinating to me, obviously, as you can tell, and I've looked into this so deeply, and I've always been so impressed with Nico, but I'm always open to hearing conversations why he's not looked at favorably.
Yeah, with Nico, for me, like you said, in Williams, and for me as well, his time where he established himself in Mercedes. The big hype was around Michael Schumacher. People weren't really interested about Nico Rosberg in Mercedes. They knew he was this talented young driver, but it was all about Michael. But, Nico, obviously it didn't quite work out how Michael wanted on that fact. But Nico, won fair and square within that battle. He got the first ever win for Mercedes. And he kind of built his reputation up. Then, that fight with Hamilton, he's the only one in the hybrid era who has pushed Hamilton to, he's one of only two drivers to ever beaten Hamilton across the full length of a season. And yes, people will say about the reliability of Hamilton in 2016, but we've already discussed this. These things happen. You still have to be there to take the opportunity. And Nico had more than kind of earned his right, with his own reliability issues in previous seasons during that fight. And it was just the way that is probably, if I, to date, because I don't know, what's to happen in the future, but if anyone would say what's a real time that you've seen Lewis Hamilton under pressure, it would be between 2014 and 2016 when he was fighting Nico Rosberg. It was an intense battle, and it is the time where I think Lewis Hamilton has sweated most during his career, and that has to be credit to the guy. If you think Lewis Hamilton is, he's in the all-time greats conversation. If you think he's one of the greats of all time, then to beat him, you have to give that guy credit as well in Nico Rosberg. And it's, for me, what Nico, Damon Hill and Jacques all share in common in terms of they won their world championships not against, some lowly opposition or some kind of, they had a good chance. They won it against the once-in-a-generation talents that they were up against. That they won it against the best. So to beat the best for your world championship, surely that has to be some credit to them as what they are as drivers. And yeah, we'll round off, and I think that rounds off. I'll look at all 6 in a bit of detail, but we'll now discuss kind of who we think are best. So we've discussed all 6, but in your opinion, Nick, who would be the best out of those 6? If I'm backing you into a corner now. We've discussed they're all great. They all have their merits. It's been a very positive, I think, discussion about them. But if you had to choose who was the best out of these guys, who would you pick?
Now, when I consider best, are you meaning best in terms of I can put them in any car, they can win, best as a driver to have on my team, or just raw talent in their prime under any circumstance?
I'm going to go with raw talent in their prime.
That does change
any circumstance.
That does change it, because I'm tempted to put someone up there that I think may cause a conversation, but I'm tempted. I'm not going to do it. Now that I sit here and think about it, it's got to be, for me, I'm a little bit more partial to the 80s and the 90s, so Nigel is pretty difficult to not rate there for me. And the driving factor behind that is he can go from the fact that he can jump from team to team. I get that that's something that was a little bit more common, but Nigel's had to fight PK. Nigel's had to fight Prost. Nigel has had to fight just about everyone you can name when you think of the all-time legends. Well, yeah, Nigel's probably had a battle with them. And in most circumstances, he's got some situation in which Nigel got the best of these drivers. And if you can say that so consistently, he's doing something right. And so it feels almost impossible not to put him there. Now, in their prime, that changes things for a couple drivers. So that's right. That's who I put at top. But then I guess this is something I'll say, just wonder what you think too. But if you talk about in their prime, Kimi is very difficult to ignore. Again, I'm very impressed by that 03 season and just his whole stint battling Michael. I think if you were to look at his results, that's pretty good. But then if you back up and go, that was probably the single most dominant time we've ever seen in Formula One a driver in terms of like points taken, in terms of their sheer gap. That run Michael went on, he just bulldozed everyone. And somehow Kimi found a way to emerge. And in some cases, really get under his skin and take it to him, like in 03. But Kimi has had such a long career, I also think if you were to shrink that down into someone's ability in their prime, Kimi's so hard to ignore. And the one I was thinking about was Villeneuve in his prime. If you were put in the best car, I still rate him incredibly, incredibly high. I think he would have needed to have had a little bit better of a season when he left. Not to prove that he's a quick driver, but other drivers on this list have done that. And Nigel maybe the best example of all, but Kimi maybe not littered with wins later on in his career. Tell me a time when Kimi was under-delivering in terms of what his role was on the team. It's difficult. And so I think in terms of a top-tier, top-level racer at all times over their career and even shrunken down, it's got to be Nigel. But I'm tempted to look at some of those other guys. But yeah, it's Nigel.
Yeah, it is a tough one, and it's a tough one just to kind of pick one. And for me, Mansell and Kimi are definitely at the top of the list just because of who they raced against in their primes and how they did it. And, with Nigel, what edges in his favour is the fact that he was fighting PK, Prost and Senna in their primes. He was going wheel to wheel, like you said, with some of the all-time greats on the list. What you could maybe say against was, that the championship that he did win was against Patrese, where everything was tailored towards Nigel. But I think he'd earned that right by that stage. That doesn't really take away what he earned. You could argue earlier on in his career, if the machinery had been there, like we said earlier in the video, he could easily have been a multiple world champion. For me, Kimi, that 2003 season against Michael, the way that he raced in 05 and his actual title in 07, was just a fantastic season and a real battle. So I think I'm gonna change. So just to kind of make things interesting. I think when we originally did this, I backed Mansell as well, but I'm going to put Kimi there, and just because in his prime he was so good. But all of these guys on this list again, and like I said at the start, we took the opportunity by doing this second time round. It was fantastic to kind of get some interaction from you guys and go through. And so we'll just round off by just getting your thoughts, Nick, on a few of these guys. And a lot went through on Kimi and Mansell. I think those were the two that came out on top, like we spoke about. Someone said, Viandra said, at their prime, he would put Kimi on top, but longevity, he would put Mansell on top, which is, I think, very much the point that you stated. But going back to kind of underrated, Villeneuve wasn't really mentioned at all on the list. And if they're mentioned at all, the comment at the top here was Jason, and he said Villeneuve was the weakest on this link. Obviously, you disagree with that. What do you make of that comment?
Yeah, I think it just comes down to one of those things where when you make that calculation, you really have to look at how good was his car, because obviously the weakest comes into the fact. If you were to just look at those couple seasons before when he's at Williams, it's impossible to say that. If you were to block out everything, which obviously you can't do, but if you go and look at where was the car in terms of its, in respect to where it was on the grid, and then you have to sort of rebalance his results, because otherwise you'd look at Damon Hill and say he was lucky, just because he didn't have the car that was, could win a race. But that would be a little bit irresponsible because he doesn't have the car. So I think for me, that one, I don't think I'll ever be able to bring someone along with me thinking about, well, Villeneuve is probably at least mid-tier on this list in their prime. The data does not support that. It doesn't make it obvious. But if you look at his 97 season, and in particular, I look at his 96 season, losing to Damon, he's a rookie. He's a young rookie with coming over directly from kart. Montoya had a little bit of a learning curve too, before he actually got his feet under him. Zanardi had his own problems coming back over after his first stint early in the 90s. But for me, Villeneuve is someone that's not the most likable, combined with the fact that he didn't have the car later. That's a very easy recipe for you not to really appreciate his pace. But his 97 season, I mean, it almost makes you say, well, Michael's car wasn't. Well, the fact that he's so quick, that you're so quick to go there with Michael, that should say something, because Michael's no slouch. He's not slow, and just because he's in the Ferrari, it was a difficult car to race, doesn't mean that Villeneuve as a sophomore in his sophomore season couldn't have rolled over. So I tend to be a little bit more of a contrarian, which I'm open to, which is probably why I'm looking at this differently. But I think we need to appreciate Villeneuve for what he was in his prime when he had the car under him.
Yeah, obviously from this discussion we had, I couldn't agree more. In terms of, I often use a kind of statement that you can be successful but unsuccessful enough to be not liked. And if you're kind of ultimately successful like Michael Schumacher, a lot of the time, although still remembered his flaws, a lot of those are kind of forgiven for the great success that he's had. And, Hamilton's kind of lesser years when McLaren wasn't, necessarily a great car, they kind of often get forgotten because of the dominance that he's had with Mercedes, and unfortunately for Villeneuve, he only had those kind of real 2 seasons in the top car, and too many kind of outweighing those, which I think kind of skews people's opinion. There'll just be a last one before we round this off, and a couple of people put Rosberg on top. What do you make of that?
I would say that not not dismissively. That seems a little bit more of a recency, but at the same time, I'm also one to hear the argument for, because I'm one who definitely backs Rosberg as a driver and what he did, and I'm very quick to say, this wasn't, he didn't run away from a fight and he had the top car and then he got out. So at the same time, it wouldn't be consistent for me to immediately dismiss that. I think probably what ways, if I had to reverse engineer how you get to that decision, the thought is, well, he beat Hamilton at probably some of his best moments. Arguably, when
that is exactly the argument that is put forward there. The fact that he beat Hamilton, I think, puts him high on a lot of people's lists. Yeah,
and I think that if let's say Kimi comes out ahead, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm going to ask you is, how do you rate Kimi now if he wins in 2003, or Montoya for that matter? But let's say Michael loses one title in the middle of his run, similar to Hamilton. How do you actually, and he comes out and probably has the most dominant season ever in 2004, how do you rate Michael now? And in turn, how do you rate Kimi after you do something like that? For me, the odds that you're going to say Kimi is the best is significantly increased. And I think it's the idea that you disrupted this sort of greatness we see. And we have hindsight. But if you rate him in 2016 or 2017, you're probably saying, yes, obviously a talented driver. But when you see what Hamilton went on to do next to Valtteri, you go, wow, that's okay. We really did not appreciate, some of us really didn't, and me included, didn't appreciate Nico for what he did. And as Hamilton wins, it gets more and more impressive.
Absolutely. That is... Yeah, that is the most impressive thing that I said, where, when we were talking about Rosberg, he is the only one in the hybrid era to push him. Yes, obviously he had the benefit of being established within the team that Valtteri hasn't had. And, Valtteri's coming into Lewis's very much team at that stage. But it's still, the dominance that not even the chasing pack can get anywhere near Hamilton. For Rosberg to do what he did is incredibly impressive, and you can make an argument. I think we very much view it would be between Mansell and Kimi, and I completely agree. That title, if he won in 2003 against Michael Schumacher during that time, it massively boosts and changed the opinion of what a lot of people have of Kimi Räikkönen, and it's the fact that the 2007 season was dominated by something off track, that, it often isn't. He is the last person to win a title for Ferrari, not Michael Schumacher. He is the last person to do that. And they've had some pretty great drivers since then in Fernando Alonso, Sebastian Vettel, and, Charles being a top talent coming in there. And Felipe obviously ran very close in 2008. They've had some top drivers at that team, but Kimi is still that guy who managed to see it over the line for Ferrari. And we could probably go on talking all day, mate, about superlatives of what these guys actually achieve within the sport and why they kind of deserve their time in the light, almost, to kind of speak. But that probably rounds things off, mate. It's been a brilliant chat. I've loved this. Even doing it a second time round, it's even better. But
I feel like we talked about different stuff. I'm like, I wish people could hear the first one, because that actually felt significantly different. Yeah,
it did. It really did. And in terms of, it was just a fantastic chat. And I think that just proves, there is just so much to talk about with them. And it's incredible. But, mate, thank you so much for coming on. I've really appreciated you coming on to the podcast.
Anytime. Absolutely anytime. This was great, and I really appreciate the conversation too. It's good to broaden what we understand and what we can learn, because that's really, we've all got something to learn. So this has been obviously helpful for me, and hopefully entertaining for everyone else.
Yeah, I can only reiterate that. We've had a great time chatting, but I hope you guys have had a great time kind of listening along as well. And if by some reason you've stumbled across us before stumbling across Nick's channel, Cranky Yankee, please do go and check him out. Probably your best way to kind of cornerstone the channel would be the storytelling element of it, and looking at the kind of stories across F1's history in a little bit more detail and in the teams. And obviously the most recent, well, hope it might even be out by the time this comes out, in terms of looking at a Brawn 2009 season review. The Williams one came out, and if you're new to F1 and you kind of think Williams is just a backmarker team, I highly recommend watching that, because it was a labour of love. But also, it really does show you how great a team Williams are in the history of this sport. But yes, please do go check out Cranky Yankee and subscribe. And if you're new around here, you can subscribe to our channel. Click that bell notification, and you can keep up to date with more kind of F1 Worldwide podcast every Saturday during this kind of Corona break, and plenty of other kind of F1 content and feeder series stuff as well, as we kind of follow the young drivers before they make it big, and so you kind of get to know them a little bit better. So when like a Charles Leclerc or Max Verstappen rocks up in Formula 1, you actually know who they are before they get there. But yeah, guys, I hope you've enjoyed it. I've had a lot of fun kind of chatting with Nick about this, and don't forget to get involved in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this kind of continued discussion. But for now, you F1 fans, keep racing.